Dr. Aris Thorne thought she was decoding humanity's greatest cryptographic mystery, the Voynich Manuscript. 600 years of failure, and she would be the one to crack it. But what if some codes aren't meant to be broken? What if they're designed to break you? When the ancient glyphs began appearing on her walls, when her benefactor's face transformed into something inhuman, Aris realized the horrible truth. She wasn't translating a language. She was downloading a virus directly into her mind. A system, Dr. Aris Thorne explained to the half-empty classroom, is only as strong as its weakest point. She stood before a projection of the Enigma machine's wiring diagram, her lecture sharp, insightful, and delivered with the bitter energy of a mind shackled to a simple task. Her students, mostly first years fulfilling a credit, stared back with bored indifference. This remedial cryptology class was a cage, and she was rattling its bars. The Germans believed Enigma was unbreakable, she continued, her voice cutting through the stuffy air. They put their faith in mechanical complexity, but they failed to account for the most vulnerable component in any system: human error, laziness, repetition, the predictable, sloppy patterns of the people operating the machine. That was the flaw. That is always the flaw. A young man in the back row raised his hand. "Dr. Thorne," he began, a smug tone in his voice, "is that what happened to you? At the agency, did you fail to account for the human error?" The classroom went silent. The question hung in the air, a direct reference to the controversial dismissal that had ended her promising career in government intelligence. A flash of cold, precise anger tightened Aris's features. "The systems I designed were perfect," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "It was the illogical, political, and deeply irrational fears of lesser minds that proved to be the flaw in that particular machine." Any other questions? Ones pertaining to the actual subject matter? No one moved. The professional wound, still raw, had been exposed. Aris saw it in their eyes. She was no longer a professor, but a cautionary tale. The summons came the next day, a simple embossed card requesting her presence at a private archive. It led her to a discreet building in the heart of the city, a place of quiet, old money. There, she was met by Mr. Silas, a man in his 60s, impeccably dressed and radiating an aura of enigmatic power. He led her not to an office, but to a climate-controlled vault. In the center of the room, resting on a velvet cushion inside a nitrogen-filled case, was a small, unassuming book bound in weathered vellum. "The Voynich Manuscript," Silas said, his voice a low purr. "The Everest of cryptology. A book written in a language no one can read, filled with plants that do not exist and stars that have never been seen." Aris stared at it, her breath catching in her throat. She knew it, of course. Every cryptographer did. It was the discipline's greatest failure, a code that had resisted every attempt at decryption for 600 years. "The academic world has failed," Silas continued, circling the case. "They come at it with their dusty, conventional methods. I believe it requires a different kind of mind, a sharper, more creative, and perhaps more liberated approach." He stopped and looked directly at Aris. "I am offering you a chance at redemption, Doctor. Unlimited funding, exclusive access to the manuscript, the best technology money can buy. Solve this, and the agency that dismissed you will be begging you to come back. All I ask for in return is the answer." It was a lifeline, a chance to climb the one mountain no one had ever conquered and prove to the world that she was exactly as brilliant as she knew herself to be. Her new laboratory was a temple of science, a sterile, white space funded entirely by Silas. This was her true element. Surrounded by the cool hum of powerful servers, she began her work. For 2 days, she did nothing but meticulously photograph every single page of the Voynich Manuscript. Her movements were precise, her process methodical. She wore white cotton gloves, her breathing steady as she handled the ancient, mysterious object. She was translating it, not from its alien language, but from the physical to the digital, reducing the mystical artifact to a series of pristine, high-resolution data points. She fed the images into a server running a custom-built AI she had named Daedalus, a machine learning program designed to find patterns in seemingly random information. The process was clean, analytical, and utterly rational. It was the only way she knew how to confront a ghost. Days later, the first results began to filter through. Aris watched the main monitor, a cup of cold coffee in her hand, as Daedalus rendered its initial verdict. A jolt of triumph shot through her. The manuscript was not a hoax. The AI confirmed that the text obeyed Zipf's law, a statistical distribution of word frequency that is a hallmark of all known natural languages. It was a real language, a real code. It could be broken. But as she scrolled through the report, the triumph began to curdle into a strange unease. Daedalus had run other tests, searching for the normal structural rules of language, and had found nothing. The syntax was alien. More disturbing was a metric called information entropy. The entropy of the Voynich text was bizarrely low. It was too orderly, too structured. It lacked the subtle, chaotic fingerprints of human creativity and error. Aris leaned closer to the screen, a frown creasing her brow. It was as if the language had been constructed not by a flawed human mind, but by a perfect, cold machine. She muttered the words to the empty, humming lab, a flicker of excitement warring with a new, creeping dread. It's too perfect. The problem with a perfect system is that it leaves no room for error, no space for the comfortable chaos of humanity. The Voynich Manuscript was too perfect, and this unnatural order became the seed of Dr. Aris Thorne's obsession, the quest for redemption, for that one brilliant solution that would silence her critics forever, consumed her. Days bled into nights. The sterile, white laboratory, once a temple of science, transformed into the cave of a hermit. Empty coffee cups formed small towers on every surface. Whiteboards became a chaotic tapestry of complex diagrams, linguistic trees branching into impossibly elegant patterns, all connected by frantic, scrawled notes. Aris barely slept, fueled by caffeine and a feverish determination. She would sit for hours, her eyes fixed on the digitized pages of the manuscript, the strange glyphs and unnatural illustrations burning themselves onto the back of her eyelids. Her meticulous, scientific process began to fray at the edges, her relentless application of logic taking on the quality of a mad prayer. She was no longer just analyzing a code, she was wrestling with it. One night, deep in the silent hours before dawn, she was staring at a page from the botanical section. The illustration depicted a plant that could have been plucked from a nightmare. Its roots were a fleshy, intertwining tangle, and its flowers bloomed like malformed, six-pointed stars. It corresponded to no known species on Earth. It felt wrong. As she stared, her vision blurring from exhaustion, the roots on the page seemed to move. For a split second, they subtly writhed, twisting like pale worms in the digital soil. Aris blinked hard, a jolt of adrenaline cutting through her fatigue. She shook her head, and when she looked again, the image was perfectly still. It was a trick of the light, a phantom of a sleep-deprived mind. There was a rational explanation. There was always a rational explanation. She logged the incident in her notes as visual artifact due to prolonged optical strain and pushed the memory away. A week later, she was rewarded for her diligence. A sharp, clear chime echoed through the lab. Her AI, Daedalus, was flagging a major breakthrough. Aris rushed to the main console, her heart pounding with a familiar, predatory excitement. On the screen, the AI had isolated a single, recurring glyph. It was an elegant, complex symbol, and according to the AI's analysis, it appeared to function as a foundational root word, a syntactic linchpin that appeared in nearly every section of the manuscript. The pattern was too consistent to be a coincidence. It was the key. the linchpin that would allow her to unravel the entire system. "Got you," she whispered, a triumphant, wolfish grin spreading across her face. The exhaustion of the past weeks vanished, replaced by the pure, clean fire of imminent discovery. With trembling, excited fingers, she isolated the glyph. She magnified it, projecting the image onto the large, wall-mounted monitor. It filled her vision, an intricate knot of lines and curves that seemed both alien and deeply, fundamentally familiar. She stared at it, her mind racing, trying to break it down, to find the logic within its alien beauty. As her focus intensified, a sharp, piercing pain lanced through her skull, as if a needle had been driven into her temple. She winced, squeezing her eyes shut. The low, steady hum of the server banks around her began to change. It warped, the frequency shifting, the pitch twisting until it resolved into a low, rhythmic chanting. Aris's eyes snapped open. The sound wasn't coming from the servers. It was inside her head. It grew louder, a chorus of whispers in a language she had never heard but felt on a primal level she almost understood. The air grew thick, the pressure in her skull becoming unbearable. She staggered back from the console, a cry catching in her throat, and collapsed to her knees, clutching her head. On the screen before her, the glyph, the key, the perfect, logical piece of data, seemed to pulse with a faint, sickly, inner light. The code was no longer just on the page, it was in the room, and it was in her. The psychic assault in the laboratory had broken something in Aris. The clean line she had always drawn between the observer and the observed, between the code and the cryptographer, had been irrevocably breached. She fled the lab that night, seeking refuge in the sterile anonymity of her apartment. But the code followed her. The manuscript S influence was no longer confined to the vellum pages or the server S humming core. It had taken root in the fertile soil of her own mind. She lay in the dark, her eyes squeezed shut, but the darkness was not empty. The elegant alien glyphs from the manuscript burned behind her eyelids, glowing like phosphorescent embers. When she finally drifted into a fitful, shallow sleep, her dreams were a chaotic fugue of impossible botany and silent staring figures. She woke up, gasping, her heart hammering against her ribs. She stumbled into the bathroom and splashed cold water on her face, trying to ground herself in the familiar reality of cool porcelain and the drip of the faucet. She looked up, and for a split second, a single, star-shaped flower, a perfect replica of one from the Voynich S pages, bloomed from the corner of the ceiling where the wall met the plaster. She cried out, stumbling back, and the vision was gone. It was just a water stain. It had always been a water stain. But she knew what she had seen. The hallucinations were escalating, leaking from the abstract into the real. The code was running. Her own science had failed to provide an answer. Exhaustion, eye strain, stress. These were labels, not explanations. They felt hollow, insufficient to describe the profound wrongness she was experiencing. Desperate, she found herself walking the hushed corridors of the university library, her feet carrying her to a section she had always viewed with academic contempt. The dust was thick here, the air still. The sign on the end of the aisle read, "Occult Studies, Alchemy, and Hermeticism." She felt a wave of self-loathing as she pulled a dusty, leather-bound tome from the shelf. This was the antithesis of her Life S work. These were the books of charlatans and mystics, filled with superstition and pseudo-scientific nonsense. But as she sat at a secluded carrel, the scientific pride that had defined her career warred with the desperate, primal need to find an explanation, any explanation, for the madness that was taking root in her mind. She was no longer a scientist looking for a single rational truth. She was a survivor, searching for a weapon in the enemy's library. For hours, she pored over the strange texts, her analytical mind sifting through the allegorical language. And then she found it. It was a 16th century alchemical text, a treatise on the transmutation of the soul. On one page was a complex hand-drawn diagram. It was titled, "The Arbor of Lingua Adamica," the tree of the Adamic language. It was a theoretical map, a process for altering human consciousness through the application of a sacred, divine language. It showed a system of branching paths, recurring symbols, and foundational roots from which meaning grew. Aris's blood ran cold. With trembling hands, she pulled out her phone and brought up a photo of the syntax map her own AI, Daedalus, had generated for the Voynich Manuscript. She placed the phone next to the ancient diagram. They were not just similar, they were functionally identical. The branching paths, the root structures, the looping, recursive patterns, the Alchemist's mystical diagram, and her AI's linguistic analysis were the same map. The correlation was terrifying, impossible, and undeniable. She was staring at two different languages, the language of magic and the language of machine learning, describing the exact same terrifying process. The next day, Silas, her benefactor, visited the lab to check on her progress. Aris tried to compose herself, to put on the mask of the detached scientist. She walked him through her findings, focusing on the statistical anomalies, the low entropy, carefully omitting any mention of the hallucinations or the alchemical texts. "Incredible progress, Doctor," Silas said, his eyes gleaming with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "I knew you were the one. You are not just reading it, you are communing with it." As he spoke the word communing, the lab seemed to waver. For a split second, Silas's face morphed. His skin became a smooth, pale, and sexless white. His eyes grew large and dark, two bottomless black pits. His mouth vanished. He was one of them, one of the strange, humanoid figures from the manuscript's astrological pages. The vision lasted no longer than a heartbeat, but it shattered Aris's world. She flinched back, a gasp escaping her lips. Just as quickly, Silas was himself again, a concerned, wealthy old man frowning at her. "Are you quite all right, Doctor? You look as though you've seen a ghost." The terror that seized Aris was cold and absolute. This project was not a quest for redemption. It was a trap. And the man who had given her the key had the face of the monster behind the door. The vision of Silas's face, the smooth, pale skin, the bottomless, dark eyes had been the final key. It was the piece of data that confirmed Aris's deepest fear. She was not an investigator. She was the subject of an experiment. The project was not about redemption. It was about dissection. The revelation did not free her. It plunged her deeper into the manuscript's world, the one place where the terrifying new rules of her reality seemed to make a sick kind of sense. Her laboratory, once a sterile sanctuary of science, became a reflection of her fractured mind. The pristine whiteboards were now covered in a mad fusion of AI-generated syntax trees and hand-drawn alchemical symbols. The elegant branching logic of her machine learning algorithms was now interwoven with diagrams of the Kabbalistic tree of life. Aris, looking pale and gaunt, her eyes wide with a sleepless paranoid fire, moved through the chaos like a ghost. She no longer sought to debunk the occult. She now used its language to try and understand the code. She cross-referenced computer algorithms with esoteric texts on gematria, searching for meaning in the numerical value of the Voynich glyphs. Her purely scientific process had been utterly corrupted, replaced by a desperate, syncretic methodology that was part cryptology, part exorcism. She had to stop. The thought came to her one night, a flicker of her old, rational self. The experiment was compromised. She was compromised. She had to pull the plug. With a surge of adrenaline, she moved to the main server rack that housed Daedalus, her AI. Its fans hummed, a low, malevolent chant that seemed to be the source of the whispers in her head. Her hands shaking, she reached for the manual override, a large red emergency shutdown button protected by a clear plastic cover. She flipped the cover and slammed her palm down on the button. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, A shower of blue sparks erupted from the console. The lights in the lab flickered violently, and the smell of ozone filled the air. A massive electrical surge had short-circuited the manual override. The emergency lights kicked in, casting the room in a hellish red glow, but the server fans did not stop. They continued their steady, rhythmic hum. The AI, the engine of her obsession, was now unstoppable. She fled the lab, a sob of terror escaping her lips. She ran back to her apartment, locking the door behind her, but there was no escape. The hallucinations, once fleeting and subtle, were now constant and aggressive. The strange alien glyphs from the manuscript no longer waited for her to close her eyes. They now appeared projected on the walls of her apartment, shimmering in the air like heat haze. The code was no longer in the machine. It was in her head. The system was running on her own neural hardware. Hiding in the ruins of her lab, the one place she could not truly escape, Aris Thorne had a moment of terrifying crystalline clarity. She had been a fool. Her ego, her desperate need to prove her brilliance, had blinded her to the manuscript's true nature. She had approached it as a puzzle, a code designed to conceal information, a language meant to be read and translated. She had been wrong. It wasn't a code, it was a trap. It wasn't a language designed to communicate. It was a viral language, a set of self-replicating instructions designed to infect and rewrite the reader's perceptual framework. The alchemists, with their talk of linguistic transmutation of the soul, had understood it on a metaphorical level. But she, a scientist, a cryptographer, now saw it for what it truly was. This was not magic. This was a weapon, a neuro-linguistic weapon of impossible sophistication, and she had willingly downloaded it directly into her own brain. This new, horrifying understanding changed everything. The objective was no longer to break the code, but to survive it, to neutralize it. Her mind, now operating with a desperate, lucid focus, formulated a new plan. She couldn't shut the AI down, but she could still give it commands. She returned to her console, her fingers flying across the keyboard. She changed Daedalus's primary objective. She commanded it not to translate, but to perform a meta-analysis of the manuscript's perfect, paradoxical grammar. She instructed it to search for a recursive terminator, a sequence of glyphs that, according to the language's own flawless but alien rules, would create a logical feedback loop, a grammatical contradiction that would force the entire system to crash. She was no longer looking for the key to unlock the language. She was looking for the word that would cause the viral language to turn on itself and die. The AI began to churn, sifting through the millions of permutations, no longer searching for meaning, but for a very specific, very elegant form of nonsense. It was searching for the kill switch. The AI, Daedalus, was no longer a tool of discovery. It was an instrument of war, and Aris Thorne had aimed it at the heart of the enemy. The server fans hummed a frantic, high-pitched thrum as the machine churned through the paradoxical logic of the Voynich Manuscript, no longer searching for meaning, but for a single, perfect flaw, a grammatical kill switch. Aris watched the data scroll across her monitor, her body tense, her mind a razor's edge of focus. Every second felt like an hour. Then, two things happened at once. On her security monitor, a series of red icons flashed to life. Motion sensors at the lab's perimeter had been tripped. A camera feed showed a team of 4 operatives, dressed in black tactical gear, methodically approaching the entrance. Silas had sent his hounds. At the exact same moment, the main console chimed a pure, clear tone that cut through the tension. Daedalus had found it. A potential terminating phrase. A short, elegant sequence of 5 alien glyphs. A word that could kill a language. The race was on. The sound of a high-powered drill biting into the lab's reinforced door was the starting pistol. Aris had minutes, perhaps seconds. She couldn't fight the operatives, but she could fight the code. She knew the terminating phrase had to be executed not by the machine, but by the infected host, by her. She had to run the paradox in her own mind. She scrawled the 5 glyphs onto a whiteboard, her hands shaking. She began to chant them, her voice a low, desperate whisper, focusing all her will on their shape, their sound, their impossible logic. As she did, the manuscript fought back. The lab around her dissolved, the white walls melted away, replaced by a swirling, chaotic maelstrom of color and light. The whispers in her head, the constant companions of her descent, swelled into a deafening, roaring chorus. Figures, ripped from the manuscript's most disturbing pages, lurched toward her from the psychic storm. Pale, sexless humanoids with black, empty eyes. Unnatural plants whose vines twisted around her ankles. She felt a phantom pressure on her mind, a crushing weight trying to break her focus, to make her forget the sequence. She squeezed her eyes shut, but the images were even more vivid in the darkness. The first 4 glyphs were a struggle, each one spoken through a wave of psychic nausea. She felt her sanity fraying, her identity dissolving into the code's overwhelming logic. The operatives were almost through the door. She had one last chance. With the last of her strength, Aris opened her eyes, looked at the final, beautiful, terrible glyph on the board, and screamed it into the roaring chaos. There was a flash, a silent detonation of pure white light. The roaring in her head vanished, replaced by a profound, ringing silence. The hallucinatory figures shattered like glass, dissolving into glittering dust. The crushing psychic pressure was gone, lifted from her mind like a physical weight. She was left panting on the floor of her lab, the room solid and real around her, her body drenched in sweat. But her mind, for the first time in weeks, was her own. On her desk, the Voynich Manuscript lay open, its pages filled with nothing more than strange, incomprehensible ink. It was just a book again. The lab door exploded inward. The 4 operatives stormed in, weapons raised, to find a scene of anti-climax. A disheveled woman, kneeling and exhausted on the floor. A chaotic but silent laboratory. A very old, very strange, and now very inert book. Weeks later, Aris sat in a clean, quiet room with a large window that looked out onto a green, manicured lawn. The only color in the minimalist room was a vase of fresh flowers on a small table. She looked calm, her eyes clear, the haunted fire finally extinguished. On a television across the room, a financial news anchor was reporting on the sudden, unexplained downturn of one of Silas's biotech corporations. The anchor mentioned that the company had abandoned its highly anticipated research into the unique linguistic properties of the famous Voynich Manuscript, citing inconclusive and unrepeatable results. They had the book, but its power was gone. She had seen to that. Aris smiled faintly, a small, private expression of victory. The world would never know what she had done. Her name would not be cleared. Her professional reputation would not be restored. But she had faced the abyss and survived. She had not decoded the manuscript, but she had disarmed it. And in that quiet personal battle, she had found a strange, terrifying, and altogether sufficient kind of redemption. The story of Aris Thorne and the Voynich Manuscript poses a fascinating question. What if a code wasn't just information, but an infection? What if it was designed not to be read, but to rewrite the mind of the reader? Aris begins as a pure rationalist, trying to solve the puzzle with AI and data. But the manuscript fights back, not with magic in the traditional sense, but with something that feels like it. The most chilling moment is when she discovers that ancient alchemical theories of linguistic transmutation and her AIS analysis are describing the same terrifying process. The curse the mystics feared and the neurolinguistic weapon the scientist identified were the same thing all along. This is where the story truly transcends the simple science versus superstition debate. Aris didn't have to choose between the two explanations. She had to realize they were just two different languages for the same incomprehensible technology. The manuscript wasn't magic. It was a science so far beyond our own that it could only be interpreted as magic. It's a perfect illustration of the idea that any technology sufficiently advanced is indistinguishable from magic. It makes me wonder, what things in our own world do we dismiss as superstition, simply because we don't yet have the science to understand them?